Welcome to Voices of the Gascoyne, the podcast series where we delve into the remarkable stories of the pastoralists who came before us. These men and women face their fair share of challenges, from day-to-day aspects of communication, transport and electricity, to natural disasters, market collapses, and the impacts of government policy. In this series, we reflect on their journeys and capture insights that can only be gained from having made it to the other side. You'll hear stories of their unacknowledged resilience. For them, it was simply life, but for us, it serves as both inspiration and a chance to learn for the future. Voices of the Gascoyne is a Gascoyne Catchments Group project made possible through support from FRRR's Helping Regional Communities Prepare for Drought initiative, funded by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. In this episode, we speak to Margot Steadman. Upon finishing school, Margot had the ultimate sliding doors moment, which led to a life she could never have imagined. Raised in suburban Perth, she helped a friend apply for a governess position on Landor Station in the Gascoyne and thought nothing more of it. When her friend backed out of the interview on the day, Margot stepped in so the employers wouldn't be stood up. And then she got the job she'd never intended to apply for. Margot ended up falling in love with the boy next door on Dalgety Down Station, where they would spend 2 decades managing, then owning the property and raising their children, before moving to Wooramel Station on the coast for another 2 decades. From fixing windmills to mustering sheep, cattle and goats, dealing with death, both human and animal, to droughts and floods, with a healthy dose of laughter and good times in amongst it all, there's not much Margot hasn't seen or done. Margot's story is incredible and a shining example of how you never know where life will take you and that you don't know what you're capable of until you try. To start our conversation, I asked Margot to share the story of that fateful moment that led her to Landor Station.
Well, a friend of mine decided that she'd like to go governessing, and she'd seen this advertisement, and she said she was too nervous to ring it. So I rang up, got the appointment to go and meet these people. That was fine. And then on the day it happened, she said, I just can't go. I just can't go. I'm too nervous. And me being me thought, well, you said you'd go. Someone's got to go. So I went and I got the job. And that's how I ended up being a governess. I really had no intention of going governessing.
So you accidentally became a governess?
Absolutely. Yes.
And where were you governessing?
I was governessing on Landor Station, which is, I don't know, maybe halfway between Meekatharra and Carnarvon. And they were a wonderful family. I stayed there for 2 years. There were 4 children, 3 at school. And the family just took me in and accepted me as sort of another member of the family. I went everywhere with them. They gave me a horse, which was the most exciting thing in my life. And they also let me take the horse when I left, which was so kind of them.
What was it like going to a station in the Gascoyne coming from Perth? It's quite a big change from being in the city.
Yes, it was. But in those days, I think stations, they were run very differently. There was money around, so there was always a cook, there were always cleaners, someone did your washing for you. Don had a chap that used to wash his vehicles to make sure they were always clean. I never did any outside work there, but we used to ride every day. So really, it didn't make that much difference to me in many ways.
With that many people around, is that why isolation wasn't really an issue for you then?
No, because in those days you ate with the family. you'd have to get dressed for dinner, and Don'd sit up at the end of the table and ring a bell. Your first course would be brought in, the bell would be rung, that would be taken away, and the next course brought in. So you didn't really ever interact with the staff other than just pleasantries, with the ones that worked in the house. And I was busy, 3 kids, and then riding every afternoon. You really didn't have time to get lonely, and I've always been a person who, fortunately, has been quite happy with my own company. So no, I didn't suffer from isolation there at all.
The experience you've described sort of paints a picture of wealth and prestige, which is not what I was envisioning for a sheep station in the middle of nowhere.
Well, I think quite a lot of them lived like that for a long time. There was certainly the different classes. I don't know whether there was a great wealth. It was just more tradition, and they could still afford staff in those days. So, and a lot of people just adhered to that staff, and there was definitely, you had this layer of staff, like the workmen, then you had another layer, and then you had the jackaroos, and then there were the overseers, and then there were managers, and then there were owners. And I believe, now I can't talk about this with any authority, but I believe in the hotels, they were all segregated. They didn't mix. And I've been told that, and I just presume it's true. I'm not sure.
Wow. It just sounds, I suppose this may have been during, when wool was a boom industry. So that, as you said, there was still money around then.
Well, when you think that, one time their wool was £1 a pound, and there was big money involved then, of course.
Now, it was while you were a governess that you met your future husband, David. How did you meet?
Well, we went to the Landor races, and he was there. A lot of young people were there, and that's where I met him. He was very charming, and I was very, very naive. Anyway, he lived on the next door station to Landor, so he used to come over on the weekends and see me, etc. And then he'd come down for Country Week cricket. He was very keen on cricket. And, when those country boys from up there used to come down to Perth, it was their major holiday of the year. So, they were out to have a good time. They had money to spend, and he just took me off my feet. And then we ended up getting married.
So you fell in love with the boy next door?
I hadn't even thought of that, but yes.
How far away was Landor Station from where David was living on Dalgety Downs?
Oh, it's our neighbour. Oh, you mean gosh.
Did it take you would it have been quite a journey for him to come and visit you?
Probably in those days, yes. I have no idea. I'd like to say 70 or 80 miles, but I don't think it was that far. About an hour's drive, I suppose.
What was dating like when we don't have any internet, no social media, no video calling. How would you keep in touch?
Pedal radio. I never spoke to him on the pedal though, but he would let Don, who was my boss at that stage, know that he'd come over, and I don't know, you just talked and went on a picnic or had dinner with the family. I don't think you can really call it dating. It was just more getting to know each other.
And then that evolved into getting married.
Yes.
And so when you left Landor Station, you didn't move very far away. You moved next door.
Yes.
So at that time, you had really spent most of your station life, I guess, inside doing the governessing. Had you had much of a chance to get out and about on the station and see what it was all about?
No.
So I guess maybe sheltered isn't the right word, but it was a different experience.
Yes, it was sheltered from the actual workings of the station. I mean, the only time you got out was when you were riding your horses or, training your race horses and that sort of thing. But that wasn't getting out. The racetrack wasn't far from the house. So, no, it was just like living at home in many ways.
So I guess in a bit of a bubble.
Yes, that's a good expression.
What was it like when you got to Dalgety Downs? What was life like?
Well, that was a complete learning curve. Went up there and, and don't forget that I'd come from sort of a regular middle-class family in Perth, and I'd been to a good school and gone to university, etc. Well, all of a sudden I was put in this place and I had to learn to cook on a wood-fire stove, and I'd never done very much cooking anyhow because my mother was such a good cook. And I had to learn to make bread, which, you made every day in those days. And washing was such a big thing because the boys in those days wore white moleskins. How my mother-in-law ever put up with it, I don't know. But anyway, so the copper would be boiled and you'd boiled and scrubbed and then they'd be washed in the old Ringer washing machine, which used to do the best. They were the best washing machines, and you'd use blue to bring out the whiteness. You probably don't even know what blue is, do you?
No. But I know people use blue or purple in their shampoos to make their hair blonder.
Well, I suppose it's the same thing. It was just made the clothes whiter and brighter. They still use them. They paint their houses with it over in India and places. So that was a huge learning curve, having to do all that. And that was done on Mondays.
I was just about to ask, how often would you have to wash a pair of moleskins? If they wore them one day, would they wear them a few days in a row?
No,
or?
of course not.
So you would do all that effort to get them clean. They'd wear them once.
Yes.
And then you'd wash it.
And everything would be ironed. The work clothes would all be ironed.
Just for them to go out and get covered in sheep poo mud. And
it was ridiculous. I mean, once my mother-in-law had gone and my great sister-in-law and I got together, we stopped all that. We didn't iron work clothes and they weren't allowed to wear moleskins and all that sort of thing.
Was that change accepted, or was there a bit of resistance to that?
No, the boys didn't care. They quite understood. And then you had to provide 3 meals a day, morning and afternoon tea as well, which again we cut out later because, I was teaching school and I thought nobody needs morning and afternoon tea. They could still have a cup of tea if they wanted, but I wasn't going to bake cakes and cookies and things. So that cooking was a big thing. We only had 32-volt power, which was run for a couple of hours in the morning and then again at night. So the washing and everything would have to be done at a certain time. But I can remember when I say washing on Monday, I mean, my mother had washing on Monday, ironing on Tuesday, and Kay had been the same. I mean, that's the way they were brought up. These days did things. Then to get hot water, we had what was called donkeys, and they were 44-gallon drums. And in those days, the drums were made of much heavier material. I don't know. So they could sustain heat. And you had to put wood in them every morning, fire them up, and that would give you your hot water. And that was an expensive option because, you used to have to take your vehicles out to get the timber and there'd be flat, but that's the way it was. So, and then the other thing I had to get used to was kerosene fridges, which were the bane of my life and everybody's life. I think you had them because they were so temperamental. The wick only had to be out a little bit and it would smoke. Every black smoke would pour through and stain your walls, and then it would go out. So you had to trim the wick and off it went. And they never kept anything really cold. So when you killed a sheep or something, and all the meat would go into the fridge, and then, of course, meat bleeds, doesn't it? Oh, it was repulsive. Put me off meat forever. And the smell was horrific. And then my parents very kindly gave me a big deep freeze, which was one by gas, which we all ended up having. And that was really, really a thrill. And I said to my mum, I never thought I would get so excited about getting a freezer.
What were the fridges like in Perth at that time? Was it, had you come from a different type of fridge?
Yeah, it was an electric fridge.
Oh, okay. And so because you didn't have the 24-hour power, that's why you had to use a kerosene. So you'd almost kind of step back in time.
Oh, absolutely. The whole thing was a step back in time, you know, with the wood fire stove and the copper and the wringer washing machine and, you know, no kitchen utensils because I think I had a 32 volt vacuum, and that was you couldn't buy 32 volt, machinery who wanted it? Only these people that lived up in Netherland.
Tell me about the social life living out at Dalgety or just in the Gascoyne. What would you do for fun?
Well, we used to have film nights for the staff. They were fun. There was always a lot of light-hearted joking and probably not taking the mickey out of people. But the big social life was when there was a meeting or New Year or something like that, and you'd go to another station or they would come to you, and it was always a 2-day entertainment. And so you just took your swags and you just had fun. You ate and drank, and the kids played games and music. There was always music. And they were great days and great social occasions, and you really appreciated them because it didn't happen very often. And then the only other social access we had was the pedal radio, which, you know, you had to get on every morning and sign in. But then when that was all finished, the women would get on and chatter because it was a man's world. You know, you never heard anything but windmills and sheep and mechanics. And the women would get on and chatter about their kids or how much their plant had grown or what a beautiful flower they had in the garden. Other than that, there really wasn't that much social occasion. Race time, of course, was always a huge social occasion. My most social event of the year was the Landau races, which usually happened about the last few weeks of August. And it was a huge event. It went for about 5 days by the time we'd got up there and come home again. And it always took about 2 or 3 days to pack because you took everything but the kitchen sink, the fridges and the pots and the pans, all the cooking gear, the mattresses, the bedding, then all the horses, the horse stuff, the horse feed and the tents. So it was a huge job preparing to go. And then Landau Race Club itself is on a property called Mount James, and it's the middle of nowhere. So you pull up there and there's this dry, dusty place, and it's got a racetrack. Well, it did in those days. It's very upmarket these days. But in those days there was an old racetrack, a shed, a stand, and then a tall stand for the judges and a bar. And everybody had their tents along the creek, which I have forgotten the name of. And most stations had their own places where they stayed every year, and you'd build a bough shed. And then all the tents would go around, and then any extras would just have to sleep in their swags somewhere. And also a beast had to be killed and quartered, and the quarter was taken up. And then, of course, it was put in a calico bag in the daytime and opened at night to air. And if you were hungry, you just went off and cut a steak off and cooked that. But it was a wonderful, had a wonderful atmosphere. And then, of course, you'd see friends that you hadn't seen for 12 months. And some people actually walked their horses to the races, which took them 4 or 5 days. And there were stables for the horses, not that many. You had to build your own with a bit of rope. And of course I was in my element with the racehorses and the gymkhana ponies and all that sort of activity that was going on. And all the ladies would always be well dressed, as long as they weren't dealing with their horses. And then at night time there was sort of dancing and two up and all those things, and the kids used to scrounge around in the dirt the next day after 2 up had been done, because they used to find money that had been fallen out of the pockets. But the night times were great because everybody wandered up and down, and if there was nothing happening in your camp, you went up to somebody else's. And of course, as you can imagine, there was quite a lot of imbibing, and those that imbibed too much that were sleeping in their trucks, which they used to clean out and then drive into the back of the camp, they'd find themselves out in the middle of the flat. The boys would take the truck out in the middle of the flats and just leave it there. And we had wheelbarrow races up and down the dry creek bed. But then, yes, it was just great, great fun. And I can remember one night our camp put on a wedding, and we got one of these little chaps who was a jockey, and we wrapped him all up in toilet paper from tip of his toe all round his head and his eyes and everywhere. And a couple of the blokes got dressed up in the ladies' ball gowns anyway, and we had this wedding service. I can't really remember very much about it, but it must have been funny because nothing was planned, and of course they were all slightly inebriated, and there was all this back and forth going on. So, there was always a lot of fun doing that sort of thing. And on the final Monday, my last day at Landor, my racehorse did very well, and I adored my racehorse. I'd bred him myself, and he was a big black horse with a star and a couple of fringes round his ankles, and he was 17 hands, but I rode him every day, so he was always very well behaved. So he did well in his race, and then they decided they'd put on a ladies' race because, girls couldn't be jockeys in those days. Anyway, I decided to enter into that. So we go round, and just before I go on to the track, a friend of mine who was always a leading jockey said, "Now, Margot, make sure you hang on to the mane so you don't get thrown back." Great tip. Did me the world of good. Anyway, we led all the way. So that was my finale at Landor, which I really miss. But there was so much fun. It was so much fun.
How often would you get to leave the station and see other people?
Well, as I say, only for meetings or special occasions. You just wouldn't go to another station. You wouldn't go over for dinner or anything like that. That just was not on. And you were very busy. It was quite a long way to go to. And if you had young children, you had to take them.
So you'd only leave the station a handful of times a year.
Yes.
It sounds like having access to that pedal radio was quite important then, just to keep in touch with your peers.
And the only time we ever had a holiday was during cricket week, of course, when everyone came to Perth.
I understand that you would also have to make some of your own fun on the station and that you were quite the practical joker.
Oh, gosh, yes. We did have some funny times. We were shearing once, and I had this gorgeous governess, and she was helping me. I was mouthing the sheep for age and taking off the ones that were culling them, actually, the ones that were old. And we went down and had lunch, and David was asking Juliet how she was going and did she enjoy it and all that sort of stuff. And she was going on about, being sick of looking at sheep's teeth to see how many they had. And then David said to her, "Now don't forget you've got to brush the sheep's teeth." And poor Juliet, she just believed him. And so she looked at him and said, "What sort of toothpaste do I use?" These things used to happen. And then another night they tied up a kangaroo and put it in her bed. We laughed at the time, but really they were harmless. We had a lot of fun, and a lot of it was harmless, but it was really taking the mickey out of people.
Sounds like there was a good sense of humour on the station.
Oh, definitely.
And was that really important to, I guess, station life can be quite, it's hard during the heat. You've got heat, cold, like you said, it was like stepping back in time. You didn't have many luxuries. So you kind of had to keep a humorous approach to life.
Oh, very, very important. And, we had a storeroom, and in the storeroom you had 44-gallon drums full of lentils and flour and all that sort of stuff. So you used to try and buy 6 months of anything that would keep at a time, because you never knew when the mail was going to get through, and you couldn't buy huge quantities in Mullawar. So, I can't remember, but I mean, there was always laughter. You know, even in the bad times, there was always laughter. I mean, if you don't have laughter, it all sort of really falls in a heap, doesn't it?
Tell me about the station itself. I understand it wasn't just a sheep station, but it had cattle as well.
Yes, it was an L-shaped station. In the bottom of the L was all sheep. And then the leg of the L we had cattle. It was sort of different country. And one of the nicest things was that we were able to keep the cattle separate from the sheep. I think we saw for a few years we had really good seasons, so we were shearing about 20,000 sheep.
At what point did you get to step out of the homestead and be out on the station?
Yes, well, I had some very, very good Aboriginal help who did the cooking. And when I had kids, they often looked after the kids. And I would have done anything to get out of that house. So, you know, I can't remember how many years it was, but I didn't honestly do that much once the 2 kids came, because I was teaching school. But holidays and things, and, you know, on the weekends, or if something interesting was happening during the week, school was stopped and everybody went out and had a nice day out in the bush doing dingo traps or windmill run or something. But anyway, the kids survived their bad education.
What was that transition like for you, though, to start working outside on the station? That would have been a huge learning curve, to have never had anything to do with sheep and cattle, and the next minute you're mustering on a motorbike and holding sheep and looking at their teeth. And
I think a lot of it's instinct, really. And, you know, when you love something and are pretty passionate about it, it all sort of happens. You know, I think anyone that was willing to learn would pick up all that sort of stuff really early. So I never seemed to have a problem with anything outdoors. Motorbike riding was a bit hit and miss for a while, but that was all right. You learn that too. Oh, gosh, I can remember one day I was going somewhere and I zipped out of the garage full bore, because I like speed a lot, you see, and I zoomed out and I could hear everybody shouting at me, and they'd had this huge piece of wire, I don't know what it was for, from one side to the other. And of course I just went straight into it. I was very lucky. What else happened? No, just, you know, you have regular falls and those sort of things.
But you got back up again and got
on. Absolutely. Just got back on the bike and off I went.
What else did you do on the station?
Well, I did windmill runs, which I really enjoyed doing, again, because I used to go off by myself. And that constituted, I think we probably had about 60 windmills on the property, and there were 3 distinct windmill runs. They all took about maybe 3-4 hours, and one was longer. The one going up into the cattle country was longer. And you just went and made sure the tanks were full, the windmills were pumping, and you cleaned the troughs. And if anything had got stuck in the trough, you pulled it out. And especially in summer, bungarras used to get under the float. And, you know, you'd be cleaning it out, and out would come this huge bungarra, and, you know, of course you'd jump 6 feet. They were completely harmless, of course. Another job that we did on the station was I learnt to become a very good windmill offsider, because you have to fix your windmills, of course, if they break down. And even if they didn't, you had to change the oil in the head every 12 months, which meant climbing up. And fortunately, heights never worried me at all. But David was a perfectionist in how to fix a windmill, and they were doing all the correct things and making sure the valves were all smooth, and I'd spend hours making them all smooth, and then you'd have to pull the column up and make sure that once you pulled it up to a certain stage, your car never moved again. And then you might have to pull it up a bit further. And again, you had to make sure that the car didn't go forward or backwards because you could break the column, because there was the big, 2-inch pipe, and then inside was the actual rods that turned the windmill. So that was a huge learning curve, and I did get yelled at quite a bit in the learning stages, because often I wouldn't do it properly and it'd move a little bit. So, the rods didn't meet or something happened, but that was all right. But it was, and then I learnt to use tools, didn't I? All these various tools. I never had it. Oh, I used to chop wood when I was a kid. But anyway, one day he had to go down the well. So I lowered him down the well. And then he told me how to use this great big, I've even forgotten what it was called. It was like a wrench. Stilson, that's right. And he didn't fully, I'm not going to take all the blame for this, because he didn't fully make me understand that when you put a Stilson on, you have to keep holding it. So I put this Stilson on this rod and, chained it all up. Fine. But then, of course, I let go of it, didn't I? And it went straight down the well. I mean, I could have killed the man. And again, I didn't, thank heavens, but again, my reaction was to burst into laughter. That's how I reacted. Anyway, so, I did learn to do quite the right things with all the various tools and the pulling up and letting down and all that sort of thing. I think I became quite a good assistant windmill man. Where we had the cattle, that was pretty wild country. And you really learned how to drive, because you were driving in a lot of sand, and a lot of the banks going down into the river were really, really steep, which was fine to go down, but then you had to learn how to get up the other side as well. So, but I really enjoyed learning all that. There was a bit of an art to it. And, mustering cattle in a vehicle is very different. I used to have a horse mainly, and which suited me far better. But I can remember one day I was in a vehicle, in an old Land Rover, and I had a friend up from Perth who, she got up every morning and put on full makeup and all that, which was fine. But anyway, we're out there, and we had a trouble with a bull, and both the boys were driving Austin they were old military vehicles, and they went just as fast backward as they did forwards, and we were all trying to control this bull. And of course he charged straight at the vehicle I was in, and his horns came through the door of where this girl was sitting. Well, she jumped onto my lap. But, in these situations, he was rocking the vehicle up and down, and I knew we were quite safe. He certainly wasn't strong enough to tip us over. And all I could do was laugh. I do laugh in the most terrible situations. And I remember another time when we were mustering, Ainsley tipped over his Austin. I can't remember the name of Austin. Anyway, doesn't really matter. And he was running around, and there was a bull going around and round chasing him. And we all just sat there and watched and laughed. Eventually the boys went in and got rid of the bull, but you have to in these occasions. They can be so dangerous, but, you just laugh. You have to laugh, don't you? And what's another story? We used to have to drove them down from the top end of the L down to the main cattle yards, which were sort of where the two parts of the L met. And that was always lovely, because you had to camp out overnight. So you'd be droving these cattle down. And Ainsley, my brother-in-law, had this beautiful grey horse, which nobody else could ride. And once the cat had settled down, he'd go out in the front and they just follow. And then at night time, you had to find a good area with trees, and then you'd put hessian all the way round so the cattle couldn't see out. And that was enough to keep these wild cattle in, because at that stage they hadn't been mustered for a long time. So there was always a lot of excitement, and in the yards being charged and jumping fences and all that sort of thing. What's another story from the cattle? Oh, I remember Justin came out for a couple of days. He was little, I don't know, maybe 8 or something, can't remember. Anyway, we got home at the end of the day, and you're always hungry because you take your crib, but that's usually gone by 8 o'clock in the morning. And anyway, he made himself this big sandwich, opened up the camp oven and piled the meat on and ate the sandwich and went to get another one. And it was riddled with maggots.
Oh.
Absolutely riddled with maggots. Oh, you should have seen his face.
You should see my face right now. Oh, my goodness. It sounds like they were busy times.
They were busy times, but great times.
And so much adventure.
So much adventure, and you're outdoors all the time, and great teammanship, I think they call it these days. You know, everyone got on, and no, it was so much fun. So much fun. Eating green meat, you know, because you'd take your meat up and it would hang in a bag over during the daytime, and then at night you'd take the bag off and you'd cut off all the green meat that had grown over the last 4 or 5 days, and nobody ever got sick. It was fine.
Would you be kept particularly busy because you had cattle and sheep, and the work that was involved with each of them would happen at different times of the year?
Yes.
So would that stretch out over a good part of the year for you?
I think not as much as you would imagine, because once shearing was over, and then later on when you brought your lambs in to be marked, etc., there were only sort of, you know, short space of time. Mustering used to take a bit of time. And with the cattle work, again, that was probably 3 or 4 weeks. And then it was just a matter of keeping the water up to the animals after that.
What was your favourite thing to do on the station when it came to the work?
Mustering, I think. Mustering on horses.
And did you have a preference for sheep or cattle?
Cattle, definitely.
You're a cowgirl.
Yeah, definitely.
What is it about cattle over sheep that...
They were easier to handle. I mean, when I say they were wild, and they were, and there was lots of excitement, but once they settle down, they're easier to handle. I mean, people talk about dumb sheep, but I think they're very clever, because you can muster those, and then one will decide to sit down. Nothing the matter with it. You couldn't get it up. You'd put it on its feet, and it wouldn't move. And then as soon as you got, 12 feet away, it'd be up and off into the bush. So I've always thought sheep were quite smart in many ways, but it was boring. Very boring mustering sheep.
Speaking of wild animals and managing them, if you were able to manage the cattle, I'm guessing that managing children was a much easier feat.
No, I was never a good manager of my children, I don't think. I was, looking back now, I mean, my friend said I was very hard on my kids, but I don't know. As I say, they've grown up all right. I just had too much else to do than worrying about my children. I think that's why I was such a bad teacher, because I was, sitting there thinking, oh, just get on with it, will you, and do what you have to do.
Finish your math. We need to go out and do a mill run.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Going back a little earlier, when the kids were born, what was it like that first time coming? I imagine, did you have your children off the station?
Yes.
What was it like coming back to living so remotely with a tiny baby?
Awful. It was terrible, because, especially with Justin, because he was hyperactive, never slept through a night. And he cried all the time. And looking back now, I would imagine someone would say to me, well, bottle feed him or do something other than try and feed him yourself, which in those days they always wanted you to do, but I didn't know. I just had this crying child all the time. And then my mother came up when he was about 3 months old and said, what's the matter with him? And I said, I don't know. This is the way he just does it all the time. And she said, well, it's wrong. He shouldn't be crying all the time. So mothers are very important. So then on from that, I had to come to Perth and get him checked out and everything. But I think it was just you really didn't know what to do. And I mean, I suppose, you think for centuries mothers have been doing things by instinct. But I didn't have any instinct about what to do with this crying child, that was for sure.
I think the difference, though, is that for centuries we've had a village around us of people who've done it before.
That's true, yes.
And so you're now out, and even, I know these days, a child health nurse will come out and visit you in your home after you've had a baby, and there's all these measures in place to keep checking up on people. Back then, you were kind of just thrown to the wolves in the middle of nowhere to just sink or swim on your own.
Absolutely.
So if you had needed help, you didn't really have, and even with what you were saying earlier about the telephone, you didn't even really have that much opportunity to talk to other people, to go into town. You didn't leave to go into town to see a nurse,
no,
to have that support, to ask those questions.
No, so, but as I say, I mean, I'm sure you'll find plenty of stories out there of mothers and babies and not knowing what to do, etc. But you get through it. It's just, sometimes it's more difficult than others. And then my daughter came along and she was so good. I used to forget about her because she'd sit in the cot playing, and I'd suddenly think, oh, I haven't fed Tiny yet. She was such a good thing after Justin.
Might be important now to mention to both of them how you love them equally.
Oh, well, I do love them equally, and I'm very proud of them both. But, Justin was a bit of a handful at that stage, and I think probably a lot of it was my fault because I really didn't have any idea of what I was doing.
What was it like in the schoolroom? How did all that work?
Oh, dear. Well, again, it was hard because the kids didn't want to be there. They wanted to be outside playing. They could hear everything that was going on. And, I wasn't probably the most impatient of teachers. But I was actually got to teach my grandchild on Wurrumal a few years ago because their governess had gone and Rach was too busy, to do the teaching in the park. And she was maybe 12, oh no, because she would have been at school then, maybe 10 or 11 or something. And one day she turned to me and said, "You're not meant to be a teacher, are you?" And I thought, well, you've summed that up really well.
If only somebody had said that to me 30, 40 years ago.
Yes, yeah. But, I think you'd find lots of stories about mothers and patients and, there were other things to do too. You still had staff to feed, vegetable garden to attend to, the lawns to mow and water and all that sort of thing.
It sounds like you and the children were equally enthusiastic or unenthusiastic about being in the classroom. It was it was shared amongst all of you.
Absolutely, yes.
How did the schooling work in those days? Did you have School of the Air or was it correspondence?
We had correspondence and School of the Air. Each class had literally, I think it was 20 minutes. And then each child was allowed to speak for those 20 minutes or present news, which was sometimes very embarrassing to the parents. You could hear the parents or the governor saying, no, be quiet, don't say that. And Richard and Justin, who were the best of mates, they sang the same song, both of them, different properties, every day for a whole term. But there was no way you were going to change their minds. And the correspondence, you got a set which lasted a fortnight, and you'd work your way through that and then send it off to Carnarvon School of Air we were on, and they would mark it and send it back again.
How often would you receive mail?
Once a week, the mail truck came, if the roads were all right. For a while there, you didn't have coolers or freezers on the mail truck, so things like butter would arrive in a dripping mess and all that sort of thing. But later on, they all got good fridges and freezers and, so once a week the mail. And that was always very exciting. Everybody had rushed to the homestead and hoped to get some mail or...
Another aspect of parenting in the middle of nowhere is that not only are you a parent, you are the school teacher, you're sort of responsible for like, you never really get a break from the kids, do you?
No, you have to teach them everything, whether it's riding a horse or playing a piano or a musical instrument, and those terrible recorders we used to have to teach them. Yes, it's a full-time teaching job, whether it's, doing cooking for school or whatever. You taught them, so you never got a break. And in between all this, you were supposed to be a loving mother. You do love your kids, but sometimes it gets a little bit hard to actually have time to show that affection.
Because, I'm just thinking of kids, say, in town or in the city, they go to school, someone else teaches them there. Maybe after school you take them to their sport or dancing, someone else is teaching them that. So then the time you have with your child is just purely as a parent, whereas
Absolutely.
you had to be everything all in one.
And then, sometimes they'd be given homework at night, so you'd have to go back into, not the teaching mode, but you'd have to make sure that their homework was done. And yes, it was, looking back, I think that was probably one of the hardest things, because it was not a 24-hour job, but, a long job of teaching. There was lots of playtime too, mind you, lots of fun and things, but there was this constant teaching of, how to hit a cricket ball or how to catch a ball, and which a lot of people don't do down here. They send them off to these parks where people train them and teach them how to do all these things. But I wouldn't change it. I would never have changed it.
Did it breed patience?
Do I have to answer that?
No, you don't.
Because I think in some aspects I'm very patient, but in other aspects I'm not patient at all. And I think I took a lot of my impatience out on my children. I can remember riding one day with Tani. We were going for a ride after school, and she was mucking around on the horse and not riding properly, and I just got crosser. And in the end, I just said to her, look, if you're not going to ride properly, we'll go home. And I suppose that's impatience. I had no time for it. You do it properly or forget about it. But
we all have our moments, eh?
Yes, it's true. It's true. We do have our moments, but I think I had quite a few.
In hindsight,
crying was the best thing. If I cried in the schoolroom, they were wonderful. But you can only try that trick so much, because they are smart, those kids, and they catch on.
Looking back, now that you've got all this hindsight, if you had to do it again, do you think you would get a governess in so you had that separation between your role as a parent and a teacher?
Probably, yes.
Being so busy working on the station and raising the kids and teaching and all the other things you did, how did you find, I guess, something just for you, something that you could enjoy?
Well, I suppose you could consider it work, but it wasn't. It was life to me. It wasn't work. And I suppose that's because I loved it. So it never appeared like work, so to speak. Time for myself, I used to play the piano a lot. And I had so many animals, which, well, I suppose really that was my go-to for my own time, because I've always been such an animal lover. And being on a station, of course, you could have as many animals as you wanted. I think we had 8 dogs, and then I had all the horses, then I had the chooks and the ducks and the turkeys and kangaroo babies, and it was just never ending. And a cow, which I milked, and nobody come near me when I milked the cow because they were too frightened they might get the job. So that was my meditational place, I suppose you could call it. And then I had 2 big dogs, Buana and Zalua, which were both Ridgebacks. Beautiful dogs. And they were big dogs, but they were beautiful dogs, wonderful with the children. The kids used to climb all over them. And when they'd had enough, they'd just get up and walk off. very, very good guard dogs. You know, where people had come and say, be out in the garage and say, has Margot still got those dogs? Not that they ever bit anybody, but they were big and they barked and protected me. I can remember one night David came in onto the back veranda, which entered into the kitchen, and he'd put an army coat on, and then this terrible hat, and he was grubby and dirty, and he must have been killing a sheep, I think, because he had this eye, holding his eye up like that. Anyway, he banged on the door and said something in a very gruff voice. Well, the dogs just took off, and Buana, the boy, he took the door jamb and everything, and Zalua, the female, actually bit him very badly in the side. She got him as she walked past. And so he got quite badly bitten. So they were very good guard dogs, and I didn't have any sympathy with him. If he's going to do dirty tricks like that, he's got to take the consequences, doesn't he? Yeah, and also they were very sensitive to people, because sometimes you'd get staff and the dogs didn't like them at all. And interestingly enough, they were right every time. You know, these people were just not nice people. I'm not going to mention why, but they were just not nice people. So I learnt to judge all my people by my dogs. And yes, the other wonderful thing for me was we had so many horses. David's father had a horse stud for some years, so when I went there, there was still a stallion and some mares, and then, of course, I had my lovely pony that Landor had given me, and another one that someone had given me from Perth, which was just the wild pony. And so I sort of gathered up these horses. I rode every day. I used to go up there and groom them and tart them up and, you know, do all that sort of thing. And then my mare, the one that the Landor people gave me, had a foal, ugliest foal you've ever seen, so we called it Pinocchio. Grew into the most beautiful horse, and I used to race it, and it was called Menton Prince then. Big 17 hands, black with a white star. Magnificent animal, and I used to ride him every day, so he was always a really nice racehorse to ride because he was so used to being ridden. He just wasn't galloped around and then turned out and fed high-grain food and things like that. So I was very, very lucky because I just enjoyed. I used to ride morning, afternoon, whenever I got the opportunity.
It sounds like you really blossomed into this strong country woman. You were riding horses, motorbikes, mustering, doing sheep and cattle work. You know, you're involved in all aspects of the station and living out in the middle of nowhere. It's a far cry from where you started off in Perth and the life you had there.
Absolutely. You learn so much, and you'd realise how much you're capable of, because, you know, if something broke down or someone was sick, whatever it was, you had to deal with it. And most people have the ability to do that. It's just never developed, I don't think, because they're never put in that situation. And also, you know, I had a passion for that life. I loved it. It was some of the best years of my life. I mean, I had everything I wanted, didn't I? I had all my animals. I had this outdoor life. You know, I had 2 good kids, met some great people. You know, I met some wonderful people that just I would never have met before.
Speaking of people, a part and parcel of living in the middle of nowhere is that you come across some characters, whether they're the staff that live and work with you or people that just are travelling through. And I understand you have quite a few stories about the different characters you had in your time at Dalgety Downs.
Yes, well, actually, this chap was on Dalgety. I think the other one was at Landor. And a Polish chap called Harry Albinski, who had been a kid during the war, and he used to tell the most horrific tales about the boots coming down, like you see on the film, the boots coming down and everyone freezing because they didn't know which place they were going to go to and which people were going to be taken. Anyway, his whole family were taken, and I think he was hiding at the time, but his stories about suffering from hunger and having to pick up bits off the street, and then one day he told me this terrible story about how he ended up killing an Alsatian. They were both fighting over this bit of rotten food. You know, it's an eye-opener. We just don't know how we're living over here. We're so spoiled. And then another character I really remember is Harry Fletcher. And he was an old English person, very, very English. And he came from, you know, a really aristocratic family, youngest son. So there was nothing for him in England. So he got sent out to Australia. Anyway, he's never really made a success of everything and became a hermit, really, in many ways. But he still got all the English newspapers and read them. And he was so erudite and interesting to talk to. So we had people like that, which doesn't happen these days. But in those days, there were a lot of these different people walking around. And then, of course, you'd get the travellers that were going from one place to another with no idea of what they were doing. We had one chap and his wife that backed into us, and his car was stuck in reverse. And I don't think anyone could have been there but me, because I couldn't do anything for him. I know nothing about mechanics. So he went to Dairy Creek, which was 12 miles away, and he backed all the way to Dairy Creek, and Ainsley was home, fortunately. So he fixed his car, and these people just put it in first and shot straight out of the garage and kept driving. No thank you for helping or anything. And then on another occasion, this young couple came in, and they'd come from Meekatharra, and they had a flat tyre, which they'd driven on because they didn't have a spare. They had a little baby. They had no water, but they just expect you to fix everything up for them. And, I mean, sometimes they'd say thank you and sometimes they wouldn't. But, you know, it's all part and parcel of living up there, and I'm just forever grateful that I had that time, because I had quite a sheltered upbringing, and I met people and had to deal with people that there is no way I would have ever met if I'd stayed with my life in Perth and married, you know, who I was expected to marry and all that sort of thing. So it was something that I treasure, really, because I grew so much and realised that just because a person is not particularly well educated or not particularly clean or whatever you're going to say, there are really good people. They've just been unfortunate in life.
I understand you had some very special staff members who were also big characters and brought a lot of, you know, not only were they such an important part of your team in running the station and getting the work done, but they brought a lot of laughter to the station as well.
We had a large community of Aboriginals living on the property, only probably a couple of 100 metres from us. And they were just fantastic people. They had, as I mentioned before, a wonderful sense of humours, and the kids spent nearly all the time with them that they possibly could. And they learnt so much of tracking and bushmanship, and kids would be involved in all that. So, and they were a very, very integral part of our living up there. They weren't just workers, they were great friends as well. And, you know, even when they left, that lovely relationship continued on for many, many years. They really did have a good sense of humour, and there was a couple of very special ones. Neville Dodd, who Justin idolised, I caught him one day lying in the sun, and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I want to go black like Neville." And then we had another one called Jimmy Dingo, who had the most incredible sense of humour. And he he went to town. They used to go to town for their time off. And, of course, 2 days, all their money would be gone and they'd give their radio to someone and they'd buy drinks for everybody. And then, of course, they came back. Well, I remember one night I'd had a shower and I was walking around on the veranda because we slept outside all year. I didn't have any clothes on. I was just walking around and I got into bed and there was this body there. Anyway, I jumped out of bed and it was Jimmy Dingo. Anyway, God, I just about had a fit, and because don't forget that I had been very naive. Anyway, I called out to David, come and get this man out of my bed. Anyway, poor old Jimmy was suffering from the DTs. And, of course, the Ginnacubbies were after him, which they always are. And so he slept under the bed that night. And, you know, once he got over he was fine.
Can you explain to me what the DTs are and the Ginnacubbies?
Oh, the DTs, well, that's... I suppose that is the correct term, but when it's coming out from after having a very, very drunken alcoholic time, they sort of go into this withdrawal and they can get confused and they shake and they kind of hallucinate. And then the Ginnacubbies, they were the bad men in the Aboriginal tribe, and, you know, they were terrified of them. And I think probably it goes back, you know, in their culture, because they do say that, you know, if the Ginnacubbie pointed the bone at you, you did end up dying. It was a mental thing. So, I believe, you know, that's the story you hear, and I believe it. So, you know, and he really, because of all his withdrawal symptoms, he thought the Ginnacubbies were coming after him. So he had to feel safe.
Which was in your bed.
Which was in my bed. I have one just to show his wonderful sense of humour. He was in Carnarvon on a break at the hotel. Of course, he was drunk as a skunk. Anyway, there was a bit of fighting on, and so the police were called. And they took Jimmy out. And, of course, in the fighting, he had one of his eyeballs had come out of his eye socket. Anyway, he turned to the policeman and said, just be a bit careful. I'm only running on low beam at the moment. I mean, I would never have thought of saying anything like that. Was, you know, they did have an incredible sense of humour.
Very witty.
Yes, yes.
You had a visitor at the station in 1977, which at the time you probably didn't realise how significant this was, but later on this woman went on to write a book and then they made a movie about her. Tell me about that.
Oh, Robin Davidson, the camel lady. That was a wonderful time in my life. She just arrived one day and she actually didn't have her camels with her at that time. She'd left them on the road because Zelika, the female, was not well. So, and she was trying to get antibiotics down him. Now, you asked me how she got antibiotics in the middle of nowhere, but National Geographic were supporting her, and there was this wonderful photographer called Rick Schollen, and he used to fly in and out, and he'd turn up in all these different places. So he had bought antibiotics out. But, of course, how do you give a camel antibiotic tablets? So she came to see if we had fruit of any sort, apples or oranges or anything she could put the tablet right in, which we did have. So she went off and eventually got to our place with Zelika. And then she decided to stay and let Zelika recover properly. So I got to be very friendly with her because of her interesting life, which you can read about in her book called Track, so I won't go into that. Amazing girl, amazing girl. And interestingly enough, when she was there, Mick Heeman came to stay. Well, Mick was just absolutely enthralled. You know, there's this woman doesn't wear underclothes or anything, you know, because as the more she walked, the more she distributed all the material things because she began to realise she didn't need any of them. Anyway, she took him for a camel ride, which was the funniest thing out with Mickey. His faces were unbelievable. And he took her for a plane ride. So it all worked out. And then she started schooling me on how to work the camels, because at that stage she thought she might leave them at Urumog, which I was very happy about. And that was a wonderful experience, because you have to be, sometimes they can get really bad-tempered with you. And they spit at you and everything. And the only way you can bring them under control is you hit them around the head with a bit of 4x2 or something. The first time Robin did that, I was absolutely amazed, because she treated her camels like babies. They were the love of her life. And then I ended up walking with her for a few days. And that was such a very, very special time. You know, you load the camels up and, you know, and then you get to where you're going to stay. Everything has to come off and the camels are hobbled, and you have cook your meal of dried beans or whatever you're going to do, and sleep out under the stars. And the next day you pack everything up again and off you go. We rode them a little bit, but mainly we just walked. So that was a really special time with me. Anyway, she took the camels over to the coast and left them over there, so I never got to keep them.
It sounds like that would have been a really special time purely for just having some one-on-one time with another woman, going out, walking, talking.
Absolutely, and such a brave thing to do. I mean, she had to break in the camels herself. She had to put the nose pegs in herself. And she started off with everything, transistor radios and dresses and everything that one thinks one needs. And then gradually, the more she walked, the more she just left behind, until she had a little black dress, a couple of sarongs and a gun. And a food, of course, and water. And it was just, you really don't need very much in life to be happy and to survive. Yeah. No, it was a very special, very interesting person with her lifestyle, how she'd been brought up and all that.
I can hear from the way you're talking about her that, you know, you have an immense respect for her and what she was doing. But I just want to say, I bet she probably thought the same about you, you know, living out where you did and, you know, like you wouldn't think it was that special. But to her, I'm sure she also thought, you know, look at this woman living in the middle of nowhere doing what she does and how you lived.
That's quite an interesting point, because I can sit here and say to you, well, she could look at my life after what she had done as being a life of luxury too, couldn't she? It could go two ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I just thought it'd be interesting. You're probably both thinking similar things about each other.
Yes.
And if anything, it would put you sort of in the same peer group of, you know, tough, adventurous women together. So it was great of all the other people that had come through the station and the visitors you had that were maybe not so desired, like the people that would break down and not say thank you and stuff, that you could have, you know, someone on your level come through and have such a positive experience.
I don't know if one would call me an adventurous person. I suppose in some ways I would, because going back, you know, a lot of us, when we married into pastoralism, you really didn't have any idea of where you were going or what you were going to have to do.
It sounds like a bit of a theme in your life then, because that's how you got that first governessing job.
Absolutely.
You didn't know what was going to happen, but you went and did it anyway.
Well, you take life as it comes. You mustn't miss any opportunity.
Well, I think that sounds like a big sense of adventure. Speaking of adventure and all that comes with station life, and how you mentioned earlier, you have to rely on yourself. You know, if something breaks, you've got to fix it. That also relates to people when they break or they get injured. And I know you had a medical chest on the station, and while it was there, it was certainly something that didn't gather dust. It was used. Yes,
in those days it was a very sensible medical chest. It's because of the rules and regulations these days, they can't have such a basic one. Ours was very basic. Yes, we did have the heavy drugs, but they weren't given unless you were talking to a doctor over the pedal radio. But there were things in there for diarrhea and colds and headaches, and it was a very basic sort of one. And they would have been very expensive, because if you didn't use them, you still threw them out by the time they were finished. And I think it probably became too great an expense to keep those basic items which you could actually buy and keep on hand yourself. Yes, so they were very important, those medical chests, and it's like with the Royal Flying Doctor. They were a very important part of our lives. And, you know, on the pedal radio, we had a button that you pressed if in an emergency. And we had a few emergencies and a few nighttime landings, which decision was up to the pilot to make a nighttime landing, because you'd have to light the strip with kerosene and diesel in tins and with rags so they could see where they're going. We were quite fortunate at Dargety Downs because we had a very, very large strip for DC3s because, you know, they used to drop the kids off on the station from boarding school before I went up there. So we were very, very lucky. We had a really good strip.
Oh, yes.
Which was great. It was great for David Ainsley and I did our licenses there, so there was plenty of landing space for for mistakes. We had a drug addict once, which, I mean, it was completely new to both David and myself. Anyway, we got onto the Royal Flying Doctor service and they said, do this, do that, and go over and take all his drugs and, you know, make sure you look for them properly, etc. Well, we thought we'd done an excellent job, but he still had his drugs. And someone had dug me a big hole in the garden because I wanted to plant a tree or do something with it. And he came out another day and he actually fell into the hole, which was quite convenient. And anyway, we went back and the drugs were everywhere. He'd opened up his record labels and there were drugs all along and stuck them down again. I mean, we would never have thought of looking there or in the toilet or wherever he had them. That was a really interesting learning curve. And anyway, the Flying Doctor did come out and pick him up, which was great. And then I had this wonderful chap who used to help me in the garden, old Jimmy. And he sort of did a bit of everything around the place. He'd mend things up in the shearing shed or, you know, whatever needed doing, fixing and things. And anyway, one morning I got up and he wasn't around. And I thought, well, that's strange because he was an old timer and was always up daylight time. So I went up to the shearing shed and nobody there. Over to the quarters, nobody there. So eventually I went over because he used to live in my old sister-in-law's house. And there he was sitting on the toilet dead. Well, another new learning curve for me. I'd never seen a dead person in my life, had I? So I went back and got on to the police at Gascoyne Junction, friend of ours. I mean, everyone became friends up there. Called Graham and told him what happened. And he said, okay, Margot, just leave him where he is. And when I went back, he'd actually fallen off the toilet. So, yeah, God, I've done a lot, haven't I?
You have. I mean, what happens in that situation when you come across a body? What do you have to do?
Well, I just think you just leave it and get the police to come. In those days, fortunately we could get onto the junction, but I don't know what, I suppose I got on the pedal radio and called them. I don't know, but I do remember my father-in-law telling me a story about the chap that died at the bar at Landor, and they just took him over the creek and buried him and went back to the races. So, I don't know. I mean, there are dead people all over the place up there, apparently. I mean, what else could you do with the body, especially in that heat? Anyway, so Graham came out, so we put him laid him on a blanket, and then it had steps going down out of the house to the ground, and I said to Graham, I thought I was pretty under control, but I don't think I was in many ways, because as I said to Graham as we were taking him out, I said, hope I don't drop him going down the stairs. It would be a terrible thing to do. And of course, what did I do? I mean, he was heavy. I dropped him going down the stairs, and of course, me being me, started laughing. Anyway, Graham was very, very good, waited for me to get over my slight hysterical time. And we just picked him up and put him in the back of the van, and Graham took him to town, and then he was buried at Gascoyne Junction, which is where he wanted to be buried.
That's just, I mean, you wouldn't hear of that in the city.
No.
There's no way you'd find yourself in that situation having to do, there'd be someone there to do that job for you.
Absolutely.
I guess that comes back to you had to do everything on the station, including play the...
But what wonderful experiences.
Yes.
I've been very, very lucky.
I guess it's about building a full life and seeing everything the world has to offer from all aspects.
Yes. I mean, if I'd stayed in Perth and married, probably a lawyer or somebody, which was the expected thing to do, what a boring life I would have lived. You go to the gym, you go to coffee, you go to lunch.
You would have been none the wiser.
True.
I know now, in hindsight, you're able to reflect on all the things you learned. But at the time, did you, I guess, appreciate how amazing it was, what you were doing, and what a big change you'd had in your life and all these new skills you were developing?
No, I just lived from day to day, and I still live from day to day. I think it's in my nature. Now that I'm older and I do reflect and I appreciate all the things that I learned and the opportunities I had. But in those days, no, you just did it and learnt by your mistakes and went on for the next one.
During your time at Dalgety Downs, there was a particularly significant drought. I mean, drought is nothing new, especially in that region. There would certainly be dry years, but there was a big drought during your time there. What do you remember of it?
Soul destroyed. When you buy into that country, you're buying into drought. And there are dry years, which you get through, and then some of them go on for years and years and years. And all I can say is it is just soul destroying, because you destock as much as you possibly can. But there's some stock you just can't sell. It's too old, or it's got a gammy leg, or there's something the matter with it, and the market won't take it. So they're just left there. So, you'd go around, you'd have to shoot stock. You'd pull dead sheep out of trough because they'd gone to have a drink, drunk too much and collapsed into the trough and drowned. And then you've got the after effect of all that. And I can remember going around, we used to have this, it's still there, a bush called, Justin told me the name, it was a prickly bush anyhow. And the sheep would go in to try and get something to eat, a green leaf or something, and these thorns would dig into their wool, so they couldn't get out again. And so they'd just die an awful death unless you went there and were able to kill them. And then the other thing I remember vividly is having to go round and pick up dead wool because we needed the money. And dead wool was still, it wasn't very valuable, but it was money coming in. So you'd pick up all this dead, smelly wool and take it off the carcass and everything, and cut off all the dags, all the poo that had collected on the wool, and then you bale it up and take it home, and it would be all compressed in a bale of wool and sent off to Perth for sale. I found that very difficult, and heartbreaking. And then, if some of the older ewes had dropped a lamb, which they wouldn't be able to feed, you had to kill the lambs. In fact, one of the first stories my daughter said to me about remembering, and she must have been very tiny, is me picking up a lamb and just hitting it on the rhubarb of the vehicle. But you have to say to yourself, is it best to let it die a slow death, or do you kill it now so it's finished? And I found that all very, very difficult. But again, it's there, you do what you can at the time and move on. Mm.
That must have been incredibly confronting for you.
Oh, it was. I mean, having to actually kill an animal was just, I mean, I never thought I would have to do that. And being such an animal lover, it just, yeah, it really was very, very confronting. But as I say, do you let it die a slow death or do you kill it so it's over and done with, knowing that it's going to die anyhow, no matter what you do? Mm.
How did you cope during the drought, when you had to do things like that?
You just move on. I don't know how to answer that. You have to be strong, I think, but you can't let it really get to you. My friend always says to me, you've got boxes, Margot, and if you don't like something, you put it in a box, so it's not always in your mind. And I think that's what one has to do.
Compartmentalise?
Yes, that's a better word for it. And I think that's what you have to do. Otherwise, I really don't think you could survive up there, because at times like that, it's such a harsh country and, it can destroy you. I mean, it's like the farmers, a lot of the farmers now, when things are so bad and suicide's becoming a big problem. And I can understand how that happens.
What about the uncertainty that comes with drought? Because when you're in it, you don't know when it's going to end. You don't know if this is the second year of a 2 or 3 year drought or if it's the second year of a 10-year drought. When there's no end in sight, what do you do?
There's nothing you can do. Once you've done whatever you can possibly do for your stock that you've got left, there's nothing else you can do. Feeding stock up in that part of the country is totally uneconomical. And plus the fact that you've got rid of all your best stock anyhow, and there's just as I said, the older ones or the lame ones or the ones that market won't accept left. You just live from day to day. There is nothing you can do, really.
And if times were so tough and financially lean that you had to go and take wool off dead animals for a source of an income, how did that impact, I guess, just your quality of life in terms of having some leisure time or, going to the races, taking the kids on a holiday, doing something like that? How does that change during those drought years?
I don't think it changed that much. We still had a social life. We'd still go off to meetings and things, and most people were in the same situation. So you just got together and enjoyed each other's company. Yeah. And you still managed to come down to Perth for cricket week, of course.
Do you think that was really important during those times to maintain that connectivity?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mm. Yeah, but you had enough misery. Misery is not a good word. But there was enough unpleasantness and hardship in your life that you still have to balance life out if you can possibly do it. And I think those social occasions, I was very lucky. I had close neighbours and they'd come for dinner or we'd go over there for dinner. And I think it's very important to keep up the social side of it as much as you possibly can.
From one extreme to the other, after the drought, you had a flood.
Yeah.
When you think of rain, it's got to be a good thing, right? But not always.
No, it depends how it falls, of course. I've seen great seasons up there with only 4 inches of rain, but it's fallen at the right time. Whereas you could have a 2-inch rainfall and nothing else for months and get another 6. And yes, it does the country good, of course, but it doesn't bring the best vegetation back. Yes, we had a big flood and we had 8 inches in about 12, 18 hours, I think. And it was an old house. We were at Dalgety. And so all the kitchen, had water all through it. You waded in and out of the water. But floods, to me, is easier to cope with than a drought. Yes, we lived on a river and you'd see sheep and cows being washed down there. But, you didn't have to go out and pick up dead wool or pull them out of troughs or shoot them or whatever. So it didn't have that terrible side to it. I mean, really, the flood, it's very expensive because you lose your fences and, livestock. Because, living on a river, you never really know if the flood's coming. I mean, we've had huge rivers when we're in drought or coming from inland. We didn't even know the river was coming down. So, you can't just go out and move your stock off the river. So flood, I think, is much easier to cope with.
I suppose with the flood, it's in a shorter period of time as well. Like it's a single event, whereas drought can be stretched out over many years.
That's true.
With the flood that you had, at what point does all that devastation and destruction sink in? Is it when you are seeing the rain come down and you're like, this is bad? Or is it when you have to get out and about and, how long does it take you before you can actually get out and about and see what the damage is and the losses are?
Well, that depends, of course, how much rain you've had. We couldn't really get out and about for about 10 weeks. A long time we didn't get a mail truck, but we had airdrops. They used to drop various bits and actually it was really nice. You'd get biscuits and chocolate and the bases of rice and flour and things. And actually we were shearing at the time, so there were a lot of people to feed because nobody could go anywhere. So those airdrops were just fantastic, plus all the treats that came with it.
Do you get cabin fever when that happens if you can't leave? Or are you just so used to not going anywhere that
plenty of things to do, you've still got the garden and all sorts of things to keep yourself occupied. People still have to be fed. I suppose some people did, but I never did. I was very lucky. And a lot of the reasons why you didn't get out earlier than that is because, the mud and the mucks on the road, it did your vehicle so much damage. You don't want to really take your vehicle out there. You knew your stock were all fine. There was plenty of water around. They had plenty to eat. So you didn't go out until you knew you were pretty safe, not doing too much damage to your vehicle.
At any point during the drought or the flood, did you ever think, bugger this, I'm done, I just want to go live somewhere else or do something different?
Never. Never crossed my mind.
Never crossed your mind?
Never crossed my mind. That was my life. No, it never crossed my mind to leave Dalgety Downs. Later we moved to a place called Wooramel, and that did cross my mind there.
You mentioned Wooramel, which is the next station you went to live at. So in 1987, the family sold Dalgety Downs and purchased Wooramel. How did that come about? What made you want to leave Dalgety?
Well, I didn't want to leave Dalgety. As you've gathered by now, I loved the place. David had always wanted Wooramel. He'd jackarooed and got very friendly with this overseer who had always worked at Wooramel for a long time and had always spoken about it. And then when you drove from Carnarvon down to Perth, Wooramel was always lush, always fabulous. And it was just a place he had dreamed of having. So when it came on the market, he said, right, we're going to move to Wooramel. That was it.
So it wasn't really, I suppose, a joint decision?
No, definitely not a joint decision.
That must have been a pretty hard pill to swallow.
Well, yes, but again, you cope with it. But I do remember driving up to this homestead, which everyone had told me about was so beautiful, and looking at it and thinking, I don't want to live here. But you do, and you make a life there. I had great times there and I had bad times there.
How far away, or where is Wooramel in relation to Dalgety?
It's probably about 300 miles towards the coast. It's right on the coast, Wooramel. Just about 100 k's south of Carnarvon.
So it's quite different country.
Very different country, very different watering systems. not pretty. Wooramel was beautiful to the eye to look at, in my mind. Dalgety, sorry. I mean, there's nothing pretty really about that coastal country. When you get up into the Pilbara, it can be lovely. But that Gascoyne region, well, I don't think it's very pleasing to the eye. Unless the wildflowers are out or something.
I think for different people, you connect to different types of country.
Yeah.
So you might drive through one region and it's just, there's not really a way to articulate it, is it? It's just kind of your happy place, and then you drive to the next patch and you go, yeah, doesn't sing to me the same way.
No. And the social life at Wooramel was very different because there was a bitumen road. Carnarvon was 100, Geraldton was just down the road. So there weren't all these wonderful big get-togethers that I was self-entertainment so that we had when we were further inland.
So by becoming less isolated, you had, I guess, less of a social life because you had access to towns.
Yes.
The rural community events and the station events weren't as important.
No. I mean, you still went to meetings and things, but they just weren't the big overnight social staying and catching up that we were used to. I mean, we still had a social life. We had great neighbours, and you'd go into town to Carnarvon, and so there was still social life. It was just not, to me, I couldn't call it a community social life.
That must have made the transition really difficult.
I suppose it did. I mean, again, you just accept these things and do the best you can.
Can you describe the station itself to me and how it differed to Dalgety and the workload? I know you told me previously off air that, one big change was the quality of the wool that you'd get on the coast.
Yes. Well, the vegetation was very different, and we had bore drains which came from artesian bores which used to come up to the surface themselves. And it was often salty. There were different grades. Some of it, you could have a cup of tea out of if you wanted to. And they ran out in what we called bore drains, which sometimes went for, 5-6 miles. Huge job because they'd have to be cleaned out every year. So especially in a dry, you had this salty water and then this salty food that they were eating, which didn't do them very well at all. And I thought, and I still think, it was a difficult place to run. But the shearing shed, you had to work your stock about 30 miles to get them from the top end, or probably even more, down to the shearing shed, which was a huge job, and then they'd all have to be taken out again. Very different when we got a truck. You could truck some of them out. But I can't really explain why I think it was such a difficult place to run. And after years of Wooramel having wonderful seasons, we just seemed to have dries after dries. We had one massive drought, but the rest were just dry years. And also at Dalgety, we grew beautiful wool. We had what's called a 3-way clip. And, you get all your different degrees of wool, 3A, 2A, and the thicker wools and everything. And so we ended up just having a 3-way throw, which was pretty good in those days. But at Wooramel, you just could not grow good wool. And I put that down to the water and the vegetation. They'll talk about the wind off the ocean, all that sort of thing, but I don't really think that had much to do with it. It was more of what they were taking into their bodies to produce this wool.
Not only had you gone through a big change geographically, but also this was, you got Wooramel in the late 80s and you first came to Landor and Dalgety in the mid-60s. How had the landscape of station life and work changed in that time?
It was much harder to get staff in, but people didn't really want to work on stations. They were long hours, hot, and a lot of them didn't have any idea how to muster or do anything like that. And then, you still had windmills, but we never had very many of them. But we had 24-hour, no, we didn't have 24-hour power. We had 240-volt power. So we had good fridges, good freezers. You could have good kitchen appliances if you wanted them. They were able to use all the tools down in the garage. And because of the fact that it was getting more difficult and more difficult to get people to work, they started putting in traps at the watering points. And these were just big areas which were fenced, and they had like a crossover.
The spears?
Yes, spears. And then so when you wanted to trap your sheep, you put your spears on and said they'd go in one, but they couldn't come out the other. And they were very used to going in and out because for most of the year, the traps were opened. So they just walked in and out without a care. That made a huge difference to, mustering. It was easy, much easier. Mm.
It sounds like Wirramaw was, I suppose, a harder block to manage or to run than Dalgety, like a little bit more challenging for the type of country and the location. It also came with a significant population of goats.
Oh, yes. Goats were our saviour because we had a very, very, very long dry, and but there were so many goats at Wirrable. Nobody had really done anything with goats at the time. And when you've got them in big numbers, it's like any overstocking, you lose country. So we started selling goats overseas. I think we were probably the first to do it. And some years we sent off 10,000 goats. They were pretty particular in what they took on board at that time, and that got harder and harder. But they were a lovely animal to handle, more like cattle than sheep, because whether you had wild cattle or the goats, if you came in on the outer areas and just let them get used to you, they just settled down in a mob and they would just go. And in the yards, drafting could be a bit hard, but most of them, once they'd gone through a race, the big billies were difficult, of course, they would just go through. I think they were a dream to handle. And I don't know why Wirramaw was so much harder. Maybe because I didn't like the place particularly. I don't know. It's definitely a harder place to run, I think.
You mentioned that you were one of the first, if not the first, stations to start live exporting goats. What was it like kind of being the first or one of the first to do that? What were people over the fence or down the road
they used
thinking?
to laugh at it. They used to laugh at us. And then after a few years, they realised that goats, could be very important to the economy of the property. So that sort of came down. That was a two-way thing because they used to call us the goat people because, it was nice for not to have people laughing at us all the time. But then on the other hand, once they started taking goats off their property, our goats, the numbers dropped down because for some reason the goats would walk in from the Kennedy Ranges at Gascoyne Junction and they'd just keep walking over to the coast. So, we were in a wonderful position. Then people started taking their own goats off their properties. So
it's like damming the river upstream.
Absolutely.
You end up with a little puddle.
Absolutely. Yeah. So
they're quite a transient animal like that.
Yes. Yeah, they were. But
gypsy goats.
Gypsy goats, yes. Yeah. But then over the years, you sort your goats out. All the big billies go with the big horns and you get, nowadays, I think people have got a reasonable flock of goats.
On Dalgety, I know your animals were very important to you. Was that the same at Wirramaw?
When we moved from Dalgety to Wurrumul, we had 13 road trains because I had to take all my animals. So the chooks and the ducks and the geese and the cow and the horses, and I wasn't going to leave my horses there to just die out in a paddock with, people who didn't want them. And then the machinery and everything. So, no, it wasn't. I ended up, had a lot of Joeys, dogs, and I had a donkey called Henry. Justin came home one day from university in Adelaide and bought 3 or 4 of his mates. And we made up the mustering team. It was so much fun with those young boys. They used to make me laugh so much. And one of the things, they came home one day and they said, right, we're all going to have number 1s. So they all shaved their hair off. And they said, now, Margot, you've got to have a number 1. You're part of the mustering team. I said, no, I'm not having a number 1. Anyway, so 2 of the blokes held me and somebody shaved off this side of my head. So, of course, I had to have a number 1, didn't I? Oh, dear, they were funny boys. But I remember they came home once and they had this little baby donkey in their hands. It was gorgeous, and I named him Henry. And the reason why they brought him home was they'd done something that they knew that I wouldn't be all that happy about. And so all Justin's mates were very wary of it. And Justin said, don't worry, we'll just take her home an animal. She'll be fine. I mean, he knew me well. But Henry turned out to be a terrible nuisance. He used to go down in the shed and pull everything off the shelves. And then so we put him out in a paddock. And then he learned how to go down to the roadhouse. We had a roadhouse about 2 k's down, which also had a bit of a camping area. And he'd go into the people's tents and pull everything off. I mean, he really got to be a nuisance. So we had to take him way out on the station. But, I look back now and I thought, yeah, just take her home an animal. She'll be fine. Easy pleased.
Dare I ask what it was that they had done, that they needed to?
No, I can't remember. I think I probably didn't even ask. I probably was just so overjoyed at having this little baby creature, with the cross on its back and everything, that I don't know. I haven't got a clue.
Now, you mentioned goats were a very important part of the bottom line at Wurrumul. You bought the property in 87, and as many people would know, in 1991, that was the official date of the wool crash, the market collapse in Australia. What do you remember of that time? And what was the impact for you? I mean, you had goats there, but it was, your primary business was wool. But as you'd said, it wasn't the same quality you had at Dalgety. So how did that all play out for you?
I can't remember that affecting us very much at all, really. I remember it affecting us as a future business management. But I suppose because we were very lucky to have the goats, and they were very, very viable at that time, so we were still able to function pretty well and still able to send the kids to boarding school. So, and I suppose that sort of covered a lot of what was really happening to the wool viability on Wurrumul. And I think by that stage we had already started to talk about, doing something else other than trying to run sheep that were going to grow good wool. So it was a very important time for the industry, though.
One of the outcomes of that market collapse is that a lot of people, well, almost everybody at some point over the next decade got completely out of sheep and transitioned to cattle. Now, you had cattle on Wurrumul at the time. But you didn't get out of sheep. You did sort of, but not in a different way. You guys transitioned from wool sheep to meat sheep.
To meat sheep, yeah. Damaras and those sorts of sheep, which are ghastly to handle because they're such mob animals because they have to protect themselves, especially in Africa. And it's in their nature. So, trying to load them, you they wouldn't run up a ramp because they all wanted to be, they were terrible to handle. Anyway, they've and then we went into the Dorpers, but we were very, very early stages in those, which were just a lovely fat tail sheep that didn't need shearing or anything. But, I mean, we left and Justin's just grown that program. But he's nearly out of sheep now too. He's nearly all cattle.
It sounds like diversity was an important part of your business, that you had sheep, but then you had the opportunity to market the goats.
I mean, we were very lucky in the fact that when things get that bad and you've got to start looking at other avenues, and fortunately we had the goats at Wurrumul, so that was another avenue. And we brought cattle onto the place, which was another avenue. You know, if you in the situation to diversify in those anywhere in the Norwest, I think you've got to take the plunge and do it. It's probably nerve-wracking. It's going to cost you money. You don't know if it's going to work, but you've got to take that risk, because you know if we'd just stuck with sheep without goats or diversifying into anything else that we did, because we put the vineyard in as well, I mean, we wouldn't be there.
Tell me about this vineyard. Where does the idea that you're on a coastal block with sheep, cattle and goats that you think, let's grow a vineyard?
Well, that was Justin. He came back, he did ag over east and came back, and we were very fortunate. Well, we still are very fortunate at Wurrumul, because we've got a lot of freehold, which is very difficult to get, especially in the area that we have it. And he said, well, you know, what about we go into grape growing or something like that? And David and I said, oh, well, why not? So he and one of his mates started off the vineyard, and so we grew grape, and then we grew asparagus and pumpkins, and I think and zucchinis. Yes. So that was just another diversification.
I think that is certainly a theme of the time at Wurrumul, is diversification.
Yes.
Now, while you'd moved to the coast, one thing that will follow you around no matter where you go is drought. And there, of course, were dry years at Wurrumul, but there was also a significant drought. Tell me about that time and how it was different from Dalgety.
Wurrumul was, well, it was just as soul-destroying, I suppose, in many ways as Dalgety, but it was different because, again, you sell off as many stock as you possibly can before the bad drought actually hits. You've got to do it. You know, if you haven't had rain for 18 months, you start selling off. That people might not agree with that, but that's what I think. And, but there's always stock you can't sell. And so with the salty artesian water and a lot of the salty foods that you get on the coast really didn't help the animal, you know, bodily functions in any way whatsoever. So they'd come to these long ball drains and have a drink, drank too much, fell into the ball drain, and of course died. So you'd go round and you'd pull them out, and then you'd, you know, go to your troughs, and there'd be dead cattle there. You'd have to pull them away. I mean, it's not a new story at all, but it destroys, you know, it hurts the soul and certainly does something to you, I think, regardless if you say, I keep saying, oh, you just get on with life. You do, but there's still a little bit of you that has been destroyed. But I did think, I don't think the Wurrumul drought affected me as much as the Dalgety drought. Maybe because I'd been through one.
You were desensitized to it in
Probably,
some sense?
yeah. I knew what was, you know, what was what and what you had to do. And Wurrumul in a drought was really bad because there was this big plain on the northern side of the river, which was really, it was very large, had been overstocked in its time, and was just all, it wasn't even clay pans, it was just red dirt everywhere. And when the westerlies blew, it used to blow across the highway, and often people and trucks had to stop because they couldn't see where they were going. So there was a lot of talk about that, of course, and rightly so. And so then the Ag Department thought that they would come down and tell us what to do and how to fix it up and how to run the station. And this not just happened to us, it was happening everywhere where the Ag Department suddenly decided they knew all about how to work the land and the vegetation and the stock numbers in the northwest. But of course none of them really knew anything. It was all out of books and they hadn't had any experience. So they were very difficult to deal with. You'd get some really good ones who wanted to listen to you, and the old-timers who knew a little bit more about how country responded to rain and, all this sort of thing. But I can remember one day this young girl came down and went down and we had a look at the river flats, and she said to us, well, this is it. Nothing will ever grow here again. Rightio. There was no point in saying anything to her because we didn't know anything, did we? Pastoralists didn't know much. Anyway, a few years later, we had the most magnificent season. Maybe we'd had a couple of good seasons by then. And of course, all those plains were covered in buffel grass and new little bushes sprouting and lots of vesh. It was an absolute picture. And the Ag Department was still very involved with us, so they came down, all these, and, they brought specialists from Canberra and all this sort of thing to look at this terrible country that was never going to grow anything. So we're driving around the place and they're all sitting in the car saying, God, you couldn't stock this country heavily enough, could you? So, everyone makes mistakes, but I just think it's sad that they didn't listen to people who had been living up there and making a living off those places for a long time, because, yes, there was definite overstocking. There's no two ways about that. But on the other hand, there were places that hadn't been overstocked and were run. I mean, it was our livelihood. You didn't go and overstock especially in the later years, because often earlier on, I mean, when we went over to Wurrumul, nobody knew what a bad season was. It was just something that never seemed to happen. So, and I just think that it was a shame that the two couldn't meet and, say, well, we'll take your knowledge, you take our knowledge, and we'll make it work somehow. But anyway, they were pretty difficult days once, and the public started getting involved, saying that we didn't know what we were doing and all this sort of thing. So there was this huge pressure. But again, we are resilient. We all survived.
As with drought, something else that you can't really seem to escape no matter where you live is flood.
Yes.
And I understand there's a bit of a story of a flood on Wurrumul with some special creatures.
Oh, yes. We had a flood on Wurrumul, and because we were right on the riverbank, so it came up and came over the banks. Fortunately, the house was raised, but it was flooded from all around the garages and the shed and all the way down to the main road, which is a couple of k's. So Justin and I had to go and get some sheep off an island so they wouldn't stay there and starve till the water went down. So we took off on our motorbikes, which we ended up having to walk because the water was too deep. And we saw all these sheep on one little island down towards the main road. We thought, well, we'll have to get those off. And I think I had a dog and a puppy, I think. Or he might have had his dog as well, but it wasn't a sheepdog, his dog. And so he got to the island first and said, oh, don't come on here, Mum, it's riddled with snakes. Anyway, so we eventually, I don't know how we did it, we eventually got all these damn sheep into the water, and this puppy ran round the front and pushed them all back again. It was just terrible. But anyway, we eventually got them off and they sort of half swam home to where there was dry land. But, snakes and lizards and all sorts of creatures were, there getting out of the water.
While you managed to keep your distance from the snakes on that island during the flood, there was a time where you got up close and personal with a snake.
It was probably about 5-ish at night, and I think I'd gone over to turn the water pump or something off, and I noticed that it was leaking. So I bent down to tighten it, and all of a sudden this thing grabbed my hand, and it was a snake. It was a king brown, and it didn't just bite, it sort of savaged me. So I think it must have been a young one, because the bigger ones sort of bite and go off. And it was interesting because they say they don't live where there's humans. But anyway, this one was pretty savage. So I walked back to the homestead, and fortunately there was someone there, because often I wasn't, I was there by myself. Anyway, I remember calling out, help, help, help. And he came out, and he ripped my finger, and I, holding it like this, saying, I've been bitten by a snake. I mean, there are funny times to this story. And he said, well, sit down. So I sat down, and then he really got into things to be done. He got on to the flying doctor. There was another chap somewhere around. He got him to bring the vehicle up, and he bandaged me up. He knew exactly what to do, because we grew asparagus at that stage, and there were always snakes in the asparagus. It was cool and damp and nice. And I'd said to him a few days before, now you know what you're going to have to do if someone gets bitten. So I'm getting bitten. So he bandages me all up, and he carries me to the car, and off we go. And in the meantime, I'm madly pressing all the blood out of my finger that I can, thinking I was getting rid of the poison, which was completely wrong. And we're driving along, and he says, not much good, am I, for someone who's dying? Honestly, I mean, you have to make light of things, don't you? And anyway, so we were on our way into town. He'd put 3 bandages on, and by this time it's all swollen and everything. So we stopped, and he took 1 bandage off. And so we go on a bit further, and it's getting more painful and more painful as the swelling comes up. And so we take another bandage off, and then we keep going. And he said, what say I loosen the 3rd bandage? And something made me say no, because if he had done, that would have been the finish. So we met the ambulance about halfway to town, I think, and by that time I was losing it. But I do remember in the ambulance, it's one of the things I'd never forgotten it, hearing the paramedics say to each other, I don't think we've got enough oxygen. And I can remember thinking, well, that's pretty poor, isn't it? Anyway, so I get to hospital, and they do whatever they have to do. And the next thing I know, I'm, going into anaphylactic shock. And I can remember thinking, for heaven's sakes, Margot, control yourself. And the nurse is saying, you've got to tell us how you feel. Well, that's all I remember. But, they had to put the things on my chest and stick adrenaline in my heart, I think. Look, I really can't remember. I don't remember any of this. None whatsoever. Until I woke up the next day, and the nurses said, you gave us a terrible fright. And then, I sort of looked like a mongoloid. My head was all swollen up, and I couldn't see. But anyway, I got over all that. It took me a long time. And I think this is where resilience comes in, because, after about 4 or 5 months of every organ in my body was bleeding. So, and that's what happens apparently. So my friend told me she saw someone die in the surgery of a snake bite, and depending on what sort of snake it is, and everything bleeds, and then it just blows out of your body, which sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Anyway, because I was quite tired and lethargic, and also at this time we were looking at buying a farm closer to Perth so Justin and Rach, could have the station for themselves. And, and then you have to make a decision. You're going to go on living like this, sitting around like you've got nothing in life, or are you going to make an effort to get over it? And I suppose because I am a pretty resilient person, that's when I started coming good. And I mean, it certainly has affected my health. I get everything that's going around, and I've never been quite the same since, health-wise. But, it happened. I'm alive. I'm lucky. Some people die from snake bites. One of the things that I appreciate more than anything else from having my years in the bush is the fact that I had a wonderful sister-in-law. And, there were no women to talk to up there. It was just this man's country. And fortunately, she lived literally next door to me at Dargotty Downs. The only thing that separated us was an orchard. So we were very, very lucky. We'd been to the same school, not that I'd known her all that well, but we knew each other. And the support I got from her, and I guess say that goes two ways, was absolutely amazing. And, I'd just go off mustering for a few weeks without turning a hair, and Trish would be having my kids. Didn't matter whether they had mumps or measles or whatever they did. She had my two children. I mean, it was just wonderful. No, it was one of the best things about my life up there. And then they moved, but they only moved to the next door station. So the four kids, who were all very close, were still able to see a lot of them. So, and then as they got older, they were able to drive to each other's places, because children up there they're responsible, they've got good work ethic. And I used to think maybe you give them too much responsibility, but you don't. They take it. They only take on what they want to take on. They appreciate people because they don't ever really get to see many people. So when they did get to see other kids and things, it didn't matter whether there was a nasty kid in the group or not. It was just irrelevant. And they could talk to adults. So, I mean, I have to thank Trish very much for helping me rear my kids in hindsight.
Before we finish up, there's one thing that I can't not ask you about, and that is the Centenary Medal that you were awarded in 2001. What is a Centenary Medal, and how did that come to be in your hands?
I have absolutely no idea. You are never told you are nominated, and it was a complete shock to me, of course. And, I got this letter saying that I was nominated and it would be announced whenever it was announced, and I just put the letter to one side. I didn't really mean all that much, and I thought, oh, God, I'm no different to anybody else. But in hindsight, I think it was given to me for my contribution to the pastoral industry, which I don't think I contributed it to any more than anyone else. But I did end up being on a lot of committees, and, I started a few things in the Gascoyne development, whatever it's called, DGC or whatever it's called. Anyway, it was a great, great honour and totally unexpected. So
I've just got the official page up in front of me here so that everybody who hasn't come across it before knows. It says, The Centenary Medal commemorates 100 years of federation and acknowledges the challenges of the new century by recognising citizens and other people who have made a contribution to Australian society or government. So, and there was not that many of them handed out.
No, there wasn't. No. And I mean, as I said, it was just a complete and utter surprise. But as I said, a very nice one.
Looking back on your story and what an incredible story it is. What are the takeaway lessons for you?
Never give up. You can fail, but you can learn from failure. And I think, to me, one of the most important things I learnt was not to be judgmental of book. No, I'll say that differently. There's this, this old saying of never judge a book by its cover. And to me, that's one of the most important things I learnt, because, as I said, I was brought up in Perth in this strata of society. There are a lot of people that you knew you existed, but you never had anything to do with them. And I'm sorry if that sounds classy, but, that's how it was. So, and then I go up north and I meet, dirty old people, drunk old people, rowdy old people, people that swore a lot, and some of them were the most marvellous people I've ever met. And if something happened, they were the ones that were there for you. So, and I think, to me, that was one of the most important things I learned. It didn't matter who it was, where they came from. If you get on with them, that sounds a bit weak, doesn't it? If you give them a chance to talk to them and everything, there are so many good people out there that often we just ignore. Oh, and another important thing is to make sure you balance your life. All work makes someone very boring, and you must have laughs and you must have happiness. And how you get your laughs, as long as it's not hurting other people, that's fine. And laugh at yourself, because that's what keeps you going, these lighter moments of whatever is happening at the time.